Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the author series on the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Tom Miller. Tom has been writing about conflict and culture in the Americas for close to 50 years. His books include On the Border, an account of his travels along the U.S. and Mexico frontier, the Panama Hat Trail about South America, Trading with the Enemy, which takes readers on his journeys through Cuba, and about the American Southwest, Revenge of the Saguaro. Tom has received numerous literary awards and official honors. In 2008, he was honored in a ceremony in the Centro Histórico of Quito with a proclamation designating him, and I'm going to let him retranslate that into Spanish, the Illustrious Guest of Quito, for his literary contribution to Ecuador, especially the Panama Hat Trail. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you on the author series on the Success Insight podcast.
I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. Now, before we go on, how do I pronounce Illustrious Guest of Quito in Spanish? Because I didn't want to mess it up.
I think I've had that right. I'm going to, you know what? I've got the actual proclamation here, and let's see how I pronounce it.
Perfect.
See how
it's important.
Yeah, we're going right to the source, just what a writer should do.
Excellent. See, you're perfect. That's perfect.
Okay, just a moment, please.
All right. I'm on the edge of my seat here. I took 2 years of Spanish in high school, and I think even in college. And needless to say, I've not been a good student of Spanish. I should be. We should all be. But I love the Panama Hat Trail, and that book just brought back some great memories of, traveling in South America. So, and you've done a lot of it.
I have.
All right. Well, that's what we're going to be here for. And I'm really also want to really talk more about On the Border. And as I was preparing notes for today's episode, I discovered you have a connection to one of my favorite movies, the Milagro Beanfield War. So we're going to talk about that.
Oh yes, I was present during a lot of the filming of that. That's quite a movie, quite a book too, by John Nichols. Huésped Ilustre. I got it right. Huésped Ilustre.
Huésped Ilustre de Quito. Okay, so
very good,
fantastic. Well, I something that was an important part of this episode. I'm not going to edit any of it out, and we have it. And so, Tom, there's actually something else I wanted to admire is I moved to Las Vegas from Chicago, and I know you had quite the time in Chicago in the late 60s, early 70s.
That's right. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1958.
Unbelievable. And my coaching mentor would be proud of me that I am chatting with you, because I think she was there protesting. So this is like a wonderful 6 degrees of separation. So Tom, let's talk a little bit, if you could. Obviously there's a lot we could cover, and I'm sure you want to spend the better part of your day enjoying that great Tucson weather, but talk to us a little bit about your background and how you came to really focusing your career on writing. And because the books, the articles for some major logos, but that's quite a career. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I didn't even think of it as a career until I just popped my head out of the clouds and said, this really is a career. I came in the side door. I've never taken a journalism class, nor have I taken a writing class. It might have changed me forever, but I didn't. I got into it through the side door, the underground press, not the alternative press, but the underground press in the late 60s and early 70s. And it was the anti-war, anti-Vietnam War press. A lot of the slogans that came out of there, such as "the whole world is watching." A lot of slogans came out of that. and a lot of writing came out of it. One day I was sitting in an underground press office in Washington, D.C., where I was born and raised, and I looked at a poster for advertising an anti-war rally. I said, "Gee, that's terrible. That poster is terrible. I could do better than that." And some guy says, "Yeah, well, let's see you do it better than that." And I started writing for this underground paper, and then eventually I moved to Arizona. I wanted to get away from the East Coast because I looked at some of my colleagues who were 10 years down the line, and they were slump-shouldered, going from one press office to another and rewriting public relations. That's not me in 10 years. I'm getting out of here. So I moved to Arizona just on a whim, really, recommendation of a friend, and started writing here. When I got to Tucson, I realized there was no one else doing the kind of writing. I had a place myself. I was a one-man band for a while, and I was writing about, environmental movements. I was writing about the anti-war demonstrations. I was writing about some of the academic problems they have here. And, of course, we're only one hour north of Mexico, so that intrigued me a great deal. I started writing about the borderlands. What happens in Mexico happens in the U.S. What happens in the U.S. happens in Mexico. It's a 2,000-mile country, about 20 miles wide and, like I said, 2,000 miles long. Third country between the United States and Mexico, and it has its own culture, it has its own laws, its own outlaws, its own music, its own literature. It's really a third country by itself. And the more time I spent there, the more I realized I love this place, and I still do. I still love the borderlands.
When we're traveling on the borderlands, as you said, it's 2,000 miles, 20 miles, 21 miles, to bottom. There is a lot of, you've got the environment, you've got the people, the food, the languages, the music. What were some of the big discoveries? And by the way, when I found out I was going to be chatting with you for the podcast, I went and bought On the Border, because I have to admit, I want to admit to you and to my listeners, I had not read your books before. I had read some travel writing when I used to do a lot of consulting. I'd be on an airplane. I loved the travel anthology books, but I was really very intrigued by your work. And I do have On the Border. I ordered it today, and your newest book, Where Was I, on Kindle. So I'm going to be reading that very shortly. So about this book, On the Border, what are some of the fascinating aspects that our listeners would enjoy hearing from you about that experience?
Well, I'll tell you two things that are very popular. One is the Marty Robbins song, El Paso. You're familiar with that, undoubtedly. Mm-hmm. And because that has the United States, it has 3 states in it. It has New Mexico, it has Texas, and it has Chihuahua. And it's out in the West Texas town of El Paso. Well, I'm not going to sing. I'll spare your readers my singing. But there's songs like that, or always usually about bilingual love between Mexico and the United States, between individuals on one side and the other. Some of the rock and roll songs actually got into that. And besides Marty Robbins, Wolfman Jack, he was a pirate radio man in would have been, in the early Kennedy years, in the early 1960s.
Right. I remember Wolfman Jack. I mean, he was like the early 60s, late 50s. I mean, he's like one of the only guys you heard on was it AM radio?
That's right. He was able to broadcast. He had a 250,000 watt engineering facility there in Ciudad Acuña, which is just across the border from Del Rio, Texas. And because he had 250,000 watts, it would have been illegal in the U.S. for him. They wouldn't let something of that power broadcast. But he was broadcasting from Mexico, and there was a whole mythology about Wolfman Jack that he helped perpetuate. But it really got people interested in certain types of music, actually, certain types of rock and roll, certain types of popular music. Nobody knew if the guy was white or black. he had this kind of gravelly voice.
Right.
Did up to the day he died, 1995, I believe it was. He said birds would be flying and they would be near the tower and they would just drop dead. The tower was so powerful.
That's amazing.
There are a lot of songs had Wolfman Jack in them too.
Oh yeah. No, and that's what I love about the number one, the podcast, chatting with individuals like yourself, is there are so many places, stepping off points that you can then begin to explore. Because now I'm like interested. I need to listen to more about Wolfman Jack and and I know the Marty Robbins song. So now, luckily, we get to keep that in digital form. It's not lost on a bookshelf somewhere. When you are traveling along this border, where are some of your special places? Is there some food? Is it the ability to sit down with locals and just, again, without the batteries and the cell phones, and as you said in one of your quotes, the Palm Pilot, or I wouldn't have my podcast recorder with me, but just having a conversation. Where are some of your places in this exploration of the border that really continue to bring back these phenomenal memories for you?
Well, curiously enough, the town that Wolfman Jack broadcast from, or that's Ciudad Acuña, Mexico, the state of Coahuila, and the city of Del Rio. They're pretty much joined at the hip. Those two towns, Acuña and Del Rio. There's a little space between them, but not much. And I felt at ease there. I mean, like you said, you could go into a cafe there, the Borderland Cafe. Every town has a place called the Borderland Cafe. You go to the Borderland Cafe and sit down, and you might see a Border Patrol agent, you might see a drug dealer, who knows who you'll run into when you sit down in a bar, at a restaurant, a cafe in either Ciudad Acuña, Coahuila, Mexico, or Del Rio, Texas. Now, going further up the line, closer to San Diego, about halfway further up, you come to Bisbee, Arizona. Bisbee, Arizona is part Mexico, part United States, and it's all intrigue. A town that was taken when the copper mines, the Phelps Dodge copper mines stopped. They stopped mining there. The town pretty much became a ghost town and started being repopulated by artists and, pardon the expression, hippies. And it was an artsy town. Now it's somewhat of a touristy town, but it still retains some of that flavor of Bisbee in the mining towns. The copper was shipped by train from Bisbee to Douglas, Arizona, which is right on the border opposite a town called Agua Prieta, Mexico. Those three towns always intrigued me: Agua Prieta, Mexico, Douglas, Arizona, and Bisbee, Arizona. They form an interesting triad of culture along the border. On one side, sometimes you don't know which side you're on, which is the best way to look at it.
I love that. Do you still find yourself making treks down to enjoy the border? I mean, Tucson is like 20 some miles, I believe. Are you still able to enjoy that? Or I know things have changed today, 2022, than they were, 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Well, I would, except my health problems just forbid me from too much travel these days.
Okay.
So I don't get down there nearly as much as I used to.
Okay.
Last time I was at the border was Nogales, Mexico, Nogales, United States. Nogales, that's not joined at the hip. That's just one city with a fence running down the middle of it.
Talk to us a little bit about, well, one more question about On the Border. I remember a movie, oh God, it's probably in the 90s. I know I had to have been I grew up in the Detroit area and then moved. And I remember this movie called The Milagro Beanfield War. And was that would have been situated along the border, because I remember it was like developers wanted to come in and take over, versus I forget the character's name. I can remember Reuben Blades was one of the leads, like the officer, but that would have been a border based story, wouldn't that have been?
It was a border type of story. It was much further north in New Mexico, but it was a border kind of story because of the conflict and the resolution there. But it had Sonia Braga from Brazil. She played Ruby in the movie, and like you said, Ruben Blades. Was a main character in there. It was a movie that really was able to, in simple terms, was able to reduce a complex problem into Hollywood, really.
Very interesting. I was visiting a place yesterday. For our listeners, today's Monday and Sunday. I was out near Las Vegas, near Death Valley, a place called Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. And it was absolutely gorgeous, Tom. But I was reading some signage near the facilities that at one time developers tried to come in and just make this boom town and hotels and an airport. And luckily, environmental heads prevailed, and it's just the most gorgeous, natural, pristine area. And it reminds me, as I was doing the research for our episode, the book, and it was funny that there it is in words on the prep notes that you had a hand in the book. So I appreciate that you sharing. What type of, when you were there with the movie, what were you doing with them?
The reason I was there was strictly for the movie. I was writing up a story about the filming for a newspaper called the Phoenix New Times.
Okay.
I was able to be there the last 2 or 3 days of the filming. The director, as you recall, was Robert Redford, and he sometimes let the actors who were just locals who were hired for the film. He let them take over the dialogue and take over the action for a while. And then he made some changes in that, but he was very open about allowing local people to make the movie more authentic.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit, if we could. And by the way, we're going to spend some time on your newest book, Where Was I? A Travel Writer's Memoir. That's why we're here. But the other book that it really intrigued me, and I bought that as well, is the Panama Hat Trail. And after prepping the notes yesterday, I learned that the Panama Hat, I don't know why it's called Panama, but you'll share that. But I ended up doing Google searches on where do I go to get a nice, good quality Panama hat. But how did that book come about?
It came about through a very, very practical way. In that I wanted to, I'd been writing about the borderland, and I said, I don't want to do yet another borderland book. I want to go much further south. And Ecuador had a very, very, well, let's just say when they have a coup there, it's bloodless. They're squeamish about blood, so they don't have bloody coups. They have bloodless coups.
Okay.
And there's just everything about it. It had mountains, it had coast, it had cities. It was fairly sophisticated in its own way. And my brother lived there. So I went down and visited him, and the more I saw of the hats that were there, they were, I said, everybody here has got a hat called Panama hat, but I'm in Ecuador. And it turns out that Panama hats, there's a good question on Jeopardy. Where do Panama hats come from? The answer is
Ecuador.
The answer is Ecuador. They come from Ecuador, not Panama. And the reason is, it was very simple. In the 1800s, hats and other goods that were handmade in South America went by ship up to the Panama area, and then the canal certainly wasn't built yet. And it was distributed around the United States from Panama. So the hats that came up from Ecuador, from South America, all had the straw and the fabrication of the hats in South America, and they went up to Panama. Well, people just called them by their point of sale, not their point of origin. That became more and more steady. And finally, there was a photograph, very famous photograph of Theodore Roosevelt when he was president, sitting on some earth-moving equipment in the construction of the Panama Canal, and he was wearing a straw hat from Ecuador.
Right.
Everybody forgot where the Ecuador part, and they became known as Panama hats.
That's how things happen. Just one little incident, and the rest of the history is lost. Now, I imagine you have quite the collection of hats. Is that true?
I do. I have a number of Panama hats, and except no substitutes. There's some knockoffs from China, and frankly, they're not bad looking, but they're knockoffs. You must always make sure that your hat, your straw hat, comes from Ecuador. I went out with the straw cutters in the lowlands near the coast of Ecuador, near the Pacific coast. Went out with them one day, and they were with their machetes cutting the raw straw, and they would carry it back to a small village on the backs of donkeys. And then there's a whole process that follows from there. The straw goes up to the city of Cuenca. By the way, another very comfortable South American city is Cuenca. I would move there in a minute. Well, maybe 5 minutes, but I would move there quickly. And the hats then they were more the building of the hats, the fabrication of the hats, and the blocking of the hats. And the raw hats got shipped up to the United States. Right now they do. They used to be on ships, but now they're flown up. And they got. Let's say I went to the Resistol factory, although there are a number of factories in the States that process the hats. Finally, the hats go to retail outlets. So there's a number of places that will just block the hat. They'll measure your head, and you'll get the same size that you would if you had a Stetson, but you get these straw hats. And I would say that three places that I can think of that one should go for a genuine straw hat. One is called the Optimo Hat Works. That's in Bisbee, Arizona. One is the Monte Cristi Custom Hat Works in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They have the best and the most expensive hats in the States, as far as I could tell. I don't know if Paul's, like Pauls, I don't know if Paul's is still distributing and selling hats, but it's in the Bay Area. Those three for starters.
I was hoping you were going to say, Howard, if you really want to get the real deal, you have to go to Ecuador. And I would be like, I'm in.
Well, that's true. You get the authentic one. In fact, you can go to Cuenca, Ecuador, and they'll take you on tours of the hat producing areas.
I love it. Yeah, I love straw hats. I have a couple of them, though. And if we were on camera, I would ask you to go get your favorite straw hat. I'd put mine on, and we would be comparing it and this and that. But now, what amazes me too, and you've just kind of alluded to it, is the villagers who are going up to harvest the straw, and carrying it back on the backs of the donkeys, and eventually makes its way up to a fashionable store here in the U.S. or anywhere else in this world, for Western country in this world. That price change and all the money that gets added on for that had to be produced and sold. It's quite a 180-degree juxtaposition, because that villager is probably making enough to feed his family versus
yearly.
Yeah. And we are with our disposable income, here's a credit card, and all of a sudden you have a new hat. And I love the way you've depicted that in the book as well. Let's talk a little bit about your newest book. And when I hear the word memoir, I think of somebody sitting back and looking, here's what I have done, here's what I've accomplished, here's what I want to let others know about the journey I have had. And what was it that brought you to want to write Where Was I, a travel writer's memoir?
Well, I reached a certain age where instead of looking forward, I was looking backward, and I said, what can I say that hasn't been said 100 times before? And there were a lot of experiences I had as a travel writer, and travel writing is really it's almost a misnomer, because you can write about sports, you can write about music, you can write about almost anything and turn it into travel writing. Travel writing covers something that's going on when nobody's looking. I had a lot of experiences like that as I was going out with the straw cutters. Well, there weren't that many people out there other than the straw cutters themselves. a lot of traveling along the third country between the United States and Mexico. Well, right now, the place is filled with reporters and NGOs and everything there is to deal with the crisis of immigration. But again, when I started writing about traveling and writing about the border in the late 1970s, I was pretty much the only guy who was out there doing that. There was a fellow from the New York Times who eventually recruited me to help him with his coverage. The thing about travel writing, as I said, is what's going on when nobody's looking. I was looking back over my years, over my experiences, realized there may be some lesson here for another writer, for a younger writer, maybe some experiences that people look at and go, oh yeah, I heard about that. Somebody who's done it. I've tried to maintain a certain balance about writing and about the observations.
I know too the book Trading with the Enemy. I mean, you were writing that book when not many Americans, Yankees, were even allowed in Castro's Cuba at that time. How did you accomplish that?
Well, there were the regulations on the U.S. side and regulations on the Cuba side, and they sort of conflicted with each other. But I just ignored the U.S. regulations and went straight to Mexico, to Cuba via Mexico, usually by way of Cancun. You fly down to Cancun and then take Havana Airlines over to the capital of Cuba. And I got a visa from the Cuban government, just a short-term one for a couple of weeks. I used that to travel around Cuba and talk to people, and then go back to Havana and talk to the Cuban government, saying, listen, I'm not a Cuba batcher. I'm not a Cuba cheerleader. I just want to write about people who get up in the morning, go to school, go to work, come home, make dinner, make love, go dancing. I wanted to write about people, Cuba as a normal country, not as an eccentric country. And after close to a year of negotiating with them, they finally authorized a visa, which allowed me to travel where I wanted, talk to who I wanted, live where I wanted. In short, they pretty much left me alone, and I needed their help, so they were happy to help me. But the government was pretty bewildered by this because they hadn't had anybody from the States. They had people from other countries, but not from the States, coming down to Cuba and traveling around. But I was able to do that, and I said I lived there and interviewed people, and what came out was the book you mentioned, Trading with the Enemy.
Very nice, very nice. And of your works, which ones or stories would fit well into a screenplay? If you could take one or two of them, or a piece of a story, and say this has legs. This can be a full-length documentary, screenplay, motion picture, television show. Which ones of your works would lend itself to that?
I would go with actually two, which both of them intrigue me, and I'd be honored to be associated with either of them. One of them, in the book you mentioned earlier, On the Border, has a chapter called Hannigan's Grave, and this was 3 campesinos crossing the border near Douglas, Arizona, and they were kidnapped. Really, they were kidnapped by a rancher and his 2 sons. This was in 1976. And the ranchers took the 3 campesinos out into the desert and tortured them. It's as simple as that. Tied a rope around their neck and dragged them around, lit a fire and got their feet all singed, fired buckshot into their back. It was a grisly experience. One of the Mexican campesinos said they tied me like you tie a calf. It was I won't go into much detail on torturing, but the 3 guys lived to tell the story, and there was 3 or 4 years worth of court cases and demonstrations on everybody's side, and ended up with one of the brothers the father died of a heart attack. One of the brothers was convicted. One of the brothers was walked. He was found not guilty. And that whole story, the whole drama itself, lasted 3 or 4 years, and it was it really told the story of the border as a drama rather than just as a number. The other story that intrigues me is the Wolfman Jack story, how he got about setting up a pirate station in Mexico that broadcast to the States. Wolfman Jack himself was an interesting character. So either of those, the Hannigan story from On the Border, or Wolfman Jack, who I write about a little bit in Where Was I?
Tom, before we head out today, now I do want you to share your website. We'll do that in just a minute. But for our listeners, is there an insight, and we call this an insight to go on the Success Insight podcast, that you would like to leave for our listeners about? You've been on this incredible journey, and quite frankly, I wish I had in some ways been around to be your bag man. I gladly would have carried your bag because you've had some wonderful experiences. But are there some insights or an insight that you would like to leave for our listeners about your experience and how that they can then take this insight and grow from it themselves?
Yeah, it's very simple. Drop everything. If you think you have a story in you, drop everything you're doing, put it aside, and go out on your own. I'd love to have you as a bag man, but you know what? It's best going alone. I wouldn't take my wife with me. If you're on your own, you can travel. You can get experiences that you wouldn't have if you were with a second party or a third party with you. So my advice, drop everything you've got, take it, and go out, get some material, and carve a storyline out of it.
Sounds great. Well, Tom, I truly hope that I can get down to Tucson. I have good friends that live down there. It would be great to, sit with you for a few minutes, just having a conversation, enjoy a beverage, whatever that might be. I mean, you've the work that you have produced, it is wonderful, and I'm looking forward to even myself in my 60s discovering a genre, the travel and the stories that you have crafted, and I'm really looking forward to sitting down and enjoying them. So thank you so much for being on the show. And before we do head out, where should our listeners go if they would like to learn more about you and your work?
Well, we'll start out with www.tommillerbooks, all one word, tommillerbooks.com.
All right, we will do that.
www.tommillerbooks.
Sounds like a plan. Tom, thank you so much for spending time with us on the author series on the Success Insight podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you join us.
It was a pleasure for me to talk with you. Believe me.
Fantastic. Hey, listen, stay on the line. We're going to do a quick close, and then we will have a final chat ourselves, okay?
Sure.
All right, folks. What a fantastic podcast episode today, recording with Tom Miller, an award-winning author about the U.S. borderland and Latin America, and just his works on the border, the Panama Hat Trail, Trading with the Enemy, Revenge of the Saguaro. We didn't talk about that, but that's a real interesting one. And we also chatted about Where Was I?, a travel writer's memoir, and just really talk about a career and just not having set out to be a journalist per se, but really being, it's one thing to be in the right place at the right time, but it's also something entirely special when you recognize that there's an opportunity here and you just act on it. That's what I love about the story with Tom today. So do go out to tommillerbooks.com. Check out his books. They're on the website. There are links back out to Amazon, so you can pick those up in soft cover and in Kindle like I did, and just dive in, just whatever your fancy. I mean, you've got a wonderful selection of books, and just summer's coming up. I can't think of a better reason to sit outside with a nice beverage and enjoy a book. And there you have it with the work by Tom Miller. And I certainly do hope that we are able to see some of those short stories, the story with Wolfman Jack, and there's also the story with the Mexican campesinos, and just if they can become a story out on the silver screen by themselves. What a great testament to, again, incidents that have been brought to life on the written pages on Tom's work. Okay, folks, we hope you enjoyed today's episode of the author series on the Success Insight podcast. You can find us on successinsightpodcast.com. We are also on LinkedIn and on Facebook on our Success Insight podcast pages, as well as the major podcasting directories, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, Audible, you name it, you'll find us. So again, hope you enjoyed today's episode. Like it, share it, comment on it, and let us know what you think, okay? Until then, we'll see you on another episode of the Success Insight podcast. But go out there, have a phenomenal day, and we will see you again on another episode. Take care now. 3, 2, 1. All right, folks, we hope you enjoyed today's episode with Tom Miller, award-winning author about the U.S. borderland and Latin America. What a phenomenal conversation. And we were in the midst of a conversation with somebody. 3, 2, 1. Okay, folks, we hope you enjoyed today's episode with Tom Miller, award-winning author about the U.S. borderland and Latin America. What a phenomenal conversation, and the story about how Tom got started down the path of becoming a writer. And as he was chatting with it, I was thinking, some people go to school and they know exactly what they're going to become or want to become as a profession. And here Tom recognized an opportunity in the moment and decided to act on it. And because of that action and that choice he made, he became a very prolific as well as award-winning. And 3, 2, 1. Okay, folks, there you have it. Our interview with Tom Miller, award-winning author about the U.S. borderland and Latin America on the author series on the Success Insight podcast. What a fantastic episode today with Tom, as we learned his story of how he went from being just a casual underground writer to really becoming an accomplished outdoor writer of the U.S. borderland and Latin America. And these books that he has created, On the Border, The Panama Hat Trail, Trading with the Enemy, Revenge of the Saguaro, and his most current book, Where Was I? A Travel Writer's Memoir. What a testament to his accomplishments. And we hope you get a chance to go and get a copy of the book yourself, whether it's on paperback or on Kindle. You go out to tommillerbooks.com. We'll have the backlinks on our show notes. And hey, it's the summer, and why not enjoy a good book with an adult beverage or a beverage of your choice, wherever that might be, and just to take in some good literature, to turn away from the cell phones and the news and Wordle and all these other things that distract us, and just enjoy a good book and a good story. And we're so happy that Tom joined us here today to share a little bit about his journey and about what's coming up next. Hopefully we will see the stories of Wolfman Jack or the 3 Mexican campesinos up on the silver screen, and that'll be further testament to Tom and his work. All right. Now, if you enjoyed us on the author series on the Success Insight podcast, you can find us on LinkedIn and on Facebook at successinsightpodcast.com. We are also on all of the podcasting platforms, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, Audible, etc. So, and if you do listen to this episode, please like it, share it with a friend, a family member, or leave us a comment. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there and have a phenomenal day. And we will see you on a future episode of the author series on the Success Insight podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.